Kind of a strange thing we do, isn't it? Everybody waving their palm branches around. Maybe you weren't waving palm branches. In any case, whatever. I didn't turn around. I wasn't checking on anyone, so whether you wave palm branches or not. But we come and say, well, why do we do this in church? It's a strange thing. Not anything we do on any other Sunday. But around the world today, on this Sunday we call them Palm Sunday, there are churches and people get palm branches out. First of all, it's kind of odd because they don't grow here in Michigan, so we have to order these special out to bring them in. You can't go out back and cut down palm branches, but we wave them. So we might ask, well, why do we do it? We might say, well, it's in the Bible. There is the story that we heard and we read of the people waving palm branches. Now, you may have noticed when John was reading in Luke, it didn't mention palm branches, it mentioned people throwing their coats on the ground. You think, well, why don't we do that? We have to ask ourselves the question, why this particular thing? What is it we do? And we recognize when I say different versions, so in our Bibles we have 4 different Gospels, 4 different stories of the life of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of them tells this story. Each one of them tells the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem and the reactions of the crowds. They're told slightly differently, slightly different versions, but same pictures of the same story. And so we want to ask ourselves this morning the question, well, why were they waving palm branches? What was the symbolism? What was going on behind this entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem? More importantly, what does it say about who Jesus is? And maybe the question to ask is, what is the difference or what's the contrast between waving branches on a hill as Jesus enters in and later in the week, a man dying on a hill? So if we set this up again, this story happens in all 4 of the Gospels, and it's churches through the ages have celebrated this Sunday as what we call Palm Sunday, the beginning of what is often referred to as Holy Week. And so we have Palm Sunday. This Sunday enters into it. And then on Thursday, some people refer to it as Maundy Thursday, which means the command Thursday. It's the night of when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, communion, the Eucharist, where he gathered his followers, his disciples together, and they ate a meal together. And he shared with them what he was going to do again and talked to them about the bread and the wine and representing his body and his blood. And we sang about that in one of the songs earlier. And then on that next day, kind of through the night and into the next day, he was betrayed, he was arrested, he was put on trial, and then crucified on Friday afternoon. And then he was laid in a tomb. And then on Sunday morning, God raised him from the dead. And so this is what we know as Holy Week, this celebration of these significant events in the life of Jesus. These significant events that we celebrate each and every year. And one of these is this celebration of Palm Sunday, of Jesus entering into Jerusalem. And so I want us to think about it this morning as a way to begin to reflect on what it says about the kind of king that Jesus is, that he's coming into Jerusalem here. So to set the stage, he's been coming to Jerusalem, and in the Gospel of Luke, which is where we read the story from earlier, this is not an accident. Luke makes clear this is not something that Jesus kind of accidentally ends up in Jerusalem on this particular day. This was in chapter 19, way back in chapter 9, much earlier in the Gospel of Luke. It says this, as the time approached for him, that is Jesus, to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. In other words, his intent all along, his plan all along was to go to Jerusalem. He didn't arrive there by accident. He didn't get lost along the way. And he knew why he was going. A little bit earlier in Luke it says this, and he said, Jesus said, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. So Jesus has this plan all along. And I think it's also intentional that he arrives on this particular day. He arrives at the start of the celebration of Passover. And so the celebration of Passover is when the people of Israel, God's people, remembered the great events that we know as the Exodus, from the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. When God came to the people of God in slavery, he rescued them out of slavery. There were miracles. He leads them through the Red Sea, parts the waters, and then he brings them to Mount Sinai and gives them the law. And so this whole event is called the Passover. And the Passover was the last of the plagues when God sent the final plague on the people of Egypt. And they were to put the blood of a lamb across their doorpost, and the destroyer would go through and would kill the firstborn of any house that didn't have this blood of the lamb on the doorpost. And this was known as, and so each year they celebrated this great event. They looked back and they remembered that God is a God who rescues. God is a God who delivers. But not only were they looking back, they were also looking forward, because they knew, they believed that one day God would come and rescue them again. That God had rescued them, but he was going to come and rescue them again. And they knew also in part they needed rescue, because as they gathered for hundreds of years, they had been under foreign oppression and under foreign rule. When Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem, the whole nation of Israel, is under control of the Roman Empire. And so the people are gathering each and every year around this time to celebrate and look back and remember when God rescued the people out of slavery. But they're also looking forward, saying, God is going to send a rescuer again. He's going to liberate us. He's going to deliver us. And this was something the prophets, these people in the Old Testament who spoke for God, had talked about for many years. So one of them is the prophet Zechariah, who says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So you might think, well, it's kind of like the story we just heard, isn't it? And then he goes on, "I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. And as for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit." So Luke doesn't quote this passage exactly, but if we were to flip, remember I said there's 4 different stories of Jesus, 4 different Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Gospel of John uses this exact one, John chapter 12. So Jesus is entering Jerusalem. He's kind of aware of what's ahead. If you could say, Jesus is kind of lighting the fuse, so to speak. And so Jesus has told his followers to get these 2 donkeys, and it says, "The next day the crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem." And here we go. "They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, 'Hosanna,' which simply means deliver us or save us. 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel.' And then Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, 'Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt.'" That quote from Zechariah. And so we've got this picture of, put yourself in the city of Jerusalem. Scholars would guess at the time Jerusalem was maybe 50, 60,000 people on a typical day. During Passover, it may have swelled to 400,000 to 500,000. So you can imagine, take a local city and then multiply it by 10. So the crowds are there. And there's also an air of expectation, because Passover is that looking back, but it's also a looking forward. It's saying God is going to deliver us. And so there's the question each and every year, will this be the time? Is God going to deliver us? When is it going to happen? And so then we see Jesus come riding on a donkey. And so now donkey, for one, is not a normal animal for a king to ride. There were certainly some examples of it in the Old Testament, but primarily when people thought of someone riding on a donkey, they did not typically think of a king. And Jesus rides in, and you hear him being proclaimed as a king, but at this point in time, he's just a Jewish rabbi. He's a simple teacher. He's coming in. He doesn't have a crown. He doesn't have an army. He doesn't have an empire. And so when people hear the idea, or people, if you were to ask someone in Jerusalem at the time, what would it look like for a king to come riding in? Well, they would most likely imagine a king coming in on a horse, a war horse, because a horse is this picture of conquest and power. And so as we think about Palm Sunday, what I want us to do is to begin to contrast a picture of a donkey and a picture of a horse. And we have to think of a horse in terms of what the ancient world would have thought of. What would someone 2,000 years ago thought of as a horse? For us, we think of a horse as sometimes just something fun to ride. Maybe it's a farm animal, something that's in a show. But for the ancient world, a horse was primarily a weapon of war. They weren't used for farming. They weren't used for just pleasure riding. People didn't just keep horses for pleasure riding. A horse was primarily a weapon to be used. And so then we ask, well, what did God think about horses? And so in Psalm 20, it says this: some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And so here again, there's this picture of starting to ask the question, people that trust in chariots, trust in horses, what does it mean? Trust in the military power, trusting in horses as a military weapon. Or in Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah says this: woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots and in the great strength of their horsemen, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or seek help from the Lord. So we might ask ourselves, well, does God not like horses? Well, I think God loves horses. God created horses. But what he wants the people of God to understand is, where do they put their trust? Are they putting their trust in horses? In other words, are they putting their trust in the military might? Are they putting their trust in that kind of power? Or are they putting their trust in God? Are they being encouraged to trust in him for salvation? So when we see Jesus riding on a donkey, it's already a picture of saying, trust in God. Don't trust in military power. Don't see the path to victory on a horse in a military, but instead see the path to Jesus' victory in a different way. In fact, we're going to see the path to victory later in the week when Jesus dies on a cross. That's what we should see as his path to victory. Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, one of the other New Testament writers, said this: and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. In other words, the way that Jesus won the victory was by death, his own death. But I don't think when the people are gathered and they're waving their palms that they see it yet. And why? I think part because they're waving palm branches. And now we think of palm branches for us. When you think of a palm branch, most of us maybe think of, a tropic place, right? Place where we can go and enjoy a break from the cold and long, never-ending winters of the Midwest. You think of a palm branch, maybe you think just sitting on a beach, maybe fanning yourself, or maybe somebody else fanning you with a palm branch. But a palm branch being waved in the ancient world wasn't a symbol of sitting on the beach. A palm branch in the ancient world was a sign of victory and of power. It was often used in military parades or military events, not simply by the Jewish people, but by many others. But in particular, for the Jewish people, it was often a symbol of power, and particularly of military power and military conquest. In fact, about 200 years before Jesus, there was a group of people called the Maccabees. And they had a revolt led by a man named Judah the Hammer. Now, you get the idea, like when somebody's nicknamed the Hammer, it kind of tells you what kind of person they are. And so he leads a revolt against the Seleucid Empire at that time. And do you know what their symbol of victory in war was? A palm branch. And so we might imagine that when Jesus is riding in and the people are waving palm branches, they're maybe wondering, is this the Hammer coming again? Is the Hammer, is the Messiah, that is the anointed one, the one chosen by God? And Jesus was certainly not the first nor the last to proclaim himself as Messiah. There were many others along the way who proclaimed themselves. And they're wondering, they're clinging to this idea of like, who will throw off the rule of the Romans? Who is going to push them out? And I think Jesus sees this and understands what the people are thinking. Because we read this, and we heard this read, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. And he weeps over it because he realizes that the people are shouting for God's peace, but they seem to believe that it would come through conquest and military power. And why he says, if you had known only on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. And he goes on in the next few verses, he says, the days will come when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Jesus sees them and he knows what's going to happen. He sees them waving palm branches and he knows what they're thinking. That they're thinking this is the path to power. And what he's talking about is about 30 years after Jesus, in the year 66, there is a revolt by the Jewish people. They decide that the way to free themselves of Roman power is through military might. So they have a revolt. It goes on for several years until ultimately in the year 70 AD, under Vespasian, the Roman emperor, the Roman legions march and level Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And so Jesus rides into Jerusalem and he weeps because he sees the people waving the palm branches. And he says, you don't know the way to peace. You don't know the way to God's goodness. You think it comes through military power. You think it comes through violence and might, but there's a different path. And what he sees is that when he says this, he says, you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. That's in chapter 19, verse 44. You did not recognize it because they were looking for God to come in a different way. They didn't recognize that that's what the Messiah would look like, that the Messiah would look like a man hanging on a cross. And that's the question for us on Palm Sunday, is to ask ourselves, when we wave our palm branches on a Palm Sunday or on any other day of the year, when we say, God, deliver us, save us, what picture of Jesus do we have? Do we have a picture of a mighty warrior riding on a horse to crush his enemies? Do we have a picture of Jesus as an MMA fighter with a sword of vengeance? Or do we have a picture of a humble servant riding on a donkey, trusting in God? You say, well, Pastor, what about Revelation 19? Okay, we did 5 months of the book of Revelation last year. So if you want to know, you can go back and listen to all 24 sermons I did on that. But seriously, no, but the point is, just kidding. The primary image there, if you read the book of Revelation, in chapter 19, there is a picture of Jesus riding on a horse. But things we notice about it, he's riding with a robe dipped in blood, which, by the way, is his own blood because the battle hasn't been fought yet. And the only sword he is carrying is one that's coming out of his mouth. So unless it's a really strange sword, we're thinking he's speaking. He's not coming to slaughter. And there's all this imagery wrapped around it. But we want to ask ourselves, going back to this picture, when we hear this, what do we see Jesus telling us about his way and what it means to follow him? When we watch, we see someone. When we see Jesus, we see someone who understood power in a very different way. So later in this week, Jesus is going to be brought before people who many would see as people with power. He will be brought before Pilate, the Roman governor, the one who commands those Roman legions, the legionnaires that are stationed throughout the city, the legionnaires that sit in the Antonia fortress, this massive Roman fortress, built to overlook the Jewish temple, to make sure that the Jewish people stay in their place, that they don't decide to rebel. He's brought before King Herod, the king who's designated to serve over the people of Palestine, people for whom many would look and see, these are people with power. They command the legions, they command the armies, they command the government and the power. But what sort of power did they have? They had power over. They had power to order things done. Things like the execution of Jesus. For them, they understood the way to bring your vision of the world was through power. Caesar, the Roman emperor, had a vision of the world. He had a vision of the way the world should be. How did he bring that vision to pass? Through the legions marching across the world. Jesus also had a vision of the world called the kingdom of God. But how did Jesus bring his kingdom? Not through power over, but through power under. By giving up his rights, by laying down his life. And I think that's what we're called to see on Palm Sunday. To consider the way of Jesus. As we shout Hosanna, what kind of king, what kind of savior do we envision? Do we think of Jesus as a king who will take power through violence and battle? Or do we understand the irony, the plot twist of the crucifixion, that what looks like Jesus' defeat as power and violence are used on him, that is his victory? And we can misunderstand it so easily. And it's not just we who misunderstand. Jesus' followers misunderstood it. In the Gospel of Mark, there's a story of some of Jesus' followers coming to him, and they're saying, Jesus, when you take your seat in power, let us sit at your left and at your right. They had a picture of what power looks like because that's what they saw all around them. And Jesus says, no. He says, not with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. He says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So we ask ourselves as we look at how we follow Jesus in our picture of Jesus, are we seeking power over, or are we seeking to serve? Do we have the proper picture of Jesus, or do we have a distorted image of Jesus? Do we have a picture of Jesus that looks like John Wayne or John Wick, or do we have a picture of a Jesus who rides on a donkey? Do we think that ensuring our vision for the world, which we often equate with God's vision for the world, can only come through power over others and strength to wield it? Do we think that it is our call to take dominion by whatever means necessary, and in so doing, get Jesus wrong? Do we believe only by gaining power can we protect ourselves? Do we see and understand the idolatry of power, that we place our faith in something else to provide security, provision, and comfort? Or do we trust in Jesus and in his way? Trust in God as the one who saves. So I think Palm Sunday for us is a reminder that as we approach Jesus, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, that the way of Jesus is an upside down way. In the words of James Cone, he says it this way. He says, the cross is a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat. He speaks of the cross as the critique, God's critique of power. A powerless love snatching victory out of defeat. And so do we understand that that's the way of Jesus? And so we enter this week, and there are two hills. There's the Mount of Olives with the people waving their branches and shouting Hosanna with this picture of power and conquest. And at the other end of the week is a hill with a cross on it. Do we understand those two ways, that there's the way of the sword or the way of the cross? That there's the way of the horse or the way of the donkey? And so as we hold our palm branches, we're invited to hold on to the way of Jesus, to hold on to all the contradictions of the Holy Week that comes, that shows that in Jesus, victory comes through sacrifice. And maybe we feel that tension, that we can be like the people of that week, because we can imagine there were the people who were shouting Hosanna. Maybe we're the same people who turned on him later in the week. And we feel the tension in our own lives where we feel, but the way to get, we have to have power. And Jesus says, but I want to show you a different kind of power. I want to show you a different kind of way. So I would invite us as we hold our palm branches to see what makes for peace, to see who makes for peace. And who makes for peace is Jesus. Jesus, the humble king on a donkey, who will give his life as we shout and cry, deliver us, save us, Hosanna. So may we cry out and say, God, deliver us. Let us cry out to our humble and victorious King, Jesus. Amen.